You're listening to True Crime Stories for Sleep, where every shadow hides a truth and every silence tells a story. Turn off the lights, let the darkness take hold, and drift through the quiet terror of the night. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, follow, and share. It helps us continue to whisper. Certain mornings in New York City feel strangely removed from the usual rhythm of the world. Mornings when the sky is a low, unbroken sheet of gray, and the air hangs with the quiet heaviness of a city not yet stirred into motion. On those mornings, the streets seem to breathe slowly, as though they are still rubbing sleep from their eyes, waiting for the pulse of traffic, voices, and footsteps to rouse them. Late November of 1998 held many such days, but one morning in particular possessed a stillness that felt almost unnatural. The Hudson River, broad and dark under the muted light, carried a thin veil of mist on its surface. It curled and drifted in long ribbons, rolling with the tide like ghostly fingers tracing invisible paths across the water. Along the river banks near Riverside Park, the world felt deserted, suspended in that brief window before the city fully awoke. Only a handful of early joggers passed through the chilly air, their breath forming faint clouds as they moved along the damp pathway. A few dog walkers trudged by with collars in hand, their pets sniffing the frost-hardened grass. The river made its usual soft murmurs against the rocks, the gentle lapping of water the only sound untouched by human presence. It was there, just beyond the line of reeds bending under the weight of morning moisture, that something unusual caught the eye. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than another piece of washed-up river debris, one of the countless objects the Hudson carried along its slow, steady course. Trash, driftwood, lost belongings. The river offered these regularly, scattering them along its banks with little ceremony. The pale shape nestled in the mud seemed for a moment to be one more item in that familiar assortment. But as the light shifted and the mist thinned, the outline sharpened. The object's color, an unnatural pallor against the darker mud, hinted at something that did not belong among river-soaked branches and discarded refuse. It drew the eye not because it stood out dramatically, but because it blended almost too seamlessly, like something attempting to hide in plain sight. And in that subtle wrongness there was a quiet, chilling truth. Because on that morning, the river had not brought up forgotten garbage or some lost remnant cast off by the city. It had revealed something far heavier, far more human. The Hudson, calm and indifferent, had carried a secret to shore. The first officer to arrive stepped onto the riverbank with the kind of controlled caution that only comes from years of walking into scenes that most people spend their lives hoping never to witness. His boots sank slightly into the wet mud as he approached, each movement measured, deliberate, as though disturbing the silence too quickly might somehow make the moment worse. The morning air pressed cold against his face, carrying with it the muted scent of river algae and the faint metallic tang that often lingered near the Hudson. But today that familiar smell carried something heavier. The body lay partially submerged in the shallow water, caught between the reeds and the softened earth at the river's edge. It belonged to a woman, likely in her late 30s, though the river had already begun its slow, indifferent work on her. Her skin, exposed to the cold currents for hours, had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, as if light passed through her in a way it no longer had any right to. The water had softened the edges of her features, cheeks slightly sunken, lips slack, eyelashes clumped together from moisture, but despite that erosion, the marks carved into her flesh remained starkly visible. Long, deliberate incisions ran along the sides of her torso, tracing a pattern that stopped the officer's breath for a moment. They were not jagged, not hurried, not the product of panic or rage. Instead, they were disturbingly clean and precise, controlled, placed with a level of steadiness and purpose that suggested the hands behind them had known exactly what they were doing. It was the kind of detail that unsettled differently, the kind that hinted not at chaos, but at planning, at intention, at someone who had taken their time. Her clothing was coated in a thin layer of river mud, pressed against her body by the weight of the water. Strands of her dark hair had tangled themselves into wet coils, draping across her face like a veil, obscuring the expression she had worn in her final moments. Only the faintest portion of her jawline broke through the curtain of hair, pale against the dark river weeds. The officer crouched beside her, careful not to touch anything, absorbing the scene in absolute silence. The world around him continued, mist shifting over the water, distant footsteps of joggers unaware of what lay feet away, the quiet lap of the river against the bank. But here, at this small intersection of water, mud, and human tragedy, time felt strangely suspended. The horror did not rush at him. It settled slowly, cold and heavy, as the wind carried the faint smell of iron across the riverbank and into his lungs. By the time the detectives arrived at the riverbank, the morning had shifted, but not brightened. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, yet its light remained dull and diffused, smothered behind a heavy layer of cloud that turned everything the color of worn steel. The air felt dense, quiet in a way that made even the smallest sounds carry. Crime scene tape had been stretched between nearby trees, the yellow strips fluttering gently each time the wind swept in from the Hudson. Their movement added a faint, restless whisper to the otherwise subdued atmosphere, like the scene itself breathing in shallow, uneasy intervals. Crime scene photographers moved around the body with an almost reverent silence. Each click of the camera shutter sounded louder than it should have, punctuating the stillness as they captured every angle. The tilt of the woman's head, the unnatural positioning of her limbs, the lines carved into her torso, and the way the riverbank mud clung stubbornly to the fabric of her clothes. They documented the reeds bent around her, the debris caught in her hair, the delicate impression her weight had left in the soft ground beneath. Forensic technicians followed behind them, advancing with slow, methodical precision. They knelt beside the body, brushing away the river soil with fine, careful gestures, exposing fibers trapped in the fold of her clothing. Each fragment was collected, sealed, and catalogued, their gloved hands moving with the steady rhythm of practiced expertise. Others surveyed the surrounding area, sifting through patches of mud and clumps of reeds, searching for footprints, drag marks, or anything the river might have spared. The medical examiner, coat flapping in the wind, expression carved from years of experience, conducted a preliminary assessment on site. He examined the long incisions running along the woman's torso, noting the troubling precision of each cut. These were not wild slashes or erratic wounds born from rage. They were deliberate, controlled, and created with a confident hand. He observed the lack of defensive injuries on her arms and hands, an absence that spoke volumes. She had not fought back, or she had never been given the chance. He made additional notes on the strange, orderly pattern of post-mortem handling, the arrangement of her limbs, the placement of the cuts, the way the body had settled into the reeds. It all suggested someone who not only understood anatomy, but who had taken time, someone who moved with intent rather than panic. When the body was eventually lifted onto the stretcher, water that had been trapped beneath her spilled out in a thin, dark sheet, flowing across the mud before settling into a shallow, reflective pool. For a moment, the distorted image of the sky trembled on its surface, clouds rippling in the disrupted water. The detectives watched from a short distance, their faces tight with grim understanding. As the stretcher was carried away, they exchanged a single look, quiet, steady, and heavy with the weight of a realization that required no spoken confirmation. Whoever had done this had knowledge, patience, and purpose. This was not the work of desperation. This was the work of someone who understood the human body all too well. At the precinct, the woman recovered from the Hudson was temporarily entered into the system as Jane Doe, a placeholder name carrying the weight of anonymity until the truth could give her identity back. The process was clinical, almost ritualistic. Photographs taken, measurements recorded, every detail logged with the precision demanded when someone can no longer speak for themselves. Her clothing was dried and cataloged, her personal effects examined, though water had washed away most of what might have provided easy answers. Her fingerprints posed an immediate challenge. Hours in cold river water had softened the skin, leaving the ridges distorted and fragile. A technician worked under bright forensic lamps, gently blotting the fingertips, lifting what patterns remained with the slow, delicate patience of someone who knew that even a millimeter of usable print could open the door to a name. The process took time, painstaking, meticulous time, but eventually enough ridge detail emerged for a run through the state database. The detectives gathered around the monitor, the room lit only by the dull glow of computer screens and the hum of fluorescent bulbs overhead. Minutes passed, then more minutes, and then hours after the prints were first taken, the system responded with a match. A name appeared, sudden, stark, and heartbreakingly ordinary after the horror of the scene. Marianne Keller, age 38, a school guidance counselor from the Upper West Side. She had been reported missing 4 days earlier by a neighbor who grew uneasy after noticing her apartment lights burning through multiple nights, windows glowing long after Marianne should have returned home. The report had seemed like countless others, routine, uncertain, the kind that often resolved quietly. But now the missing persons file and the riverbank discovery converged with chilling clarity. With her identity confirmed, the homicide unit shifted gears. Marianne was no longer an anonymous victim. She was a woman with a life, a routine, a circle of connections, and a final set of steps that needed to be retraced. Detectives began reconstructing her last known movements, pulling surveillance footage from intersections near her apartment, reviewing phone records, interviewing coworkers, neighbors, and anyone who might have noticed even the smallest change in her behavior during the days before she vanished. They created timelines, mapped her common routes, and examined her habits. Nothing about her life stood out as dangerous or erratic. She was described as quiet, dependable, the kind of person who remembered birthdays, checked in on struggling students, and kept to a gentle, familiar routine. It was this ordinariness, the tenderness of a life lived softly, that made the violence inflicted upon her feel all the more jarring. Piece by piece, detectives moved deeper into the last days of Marianne Keller, searching for the moment where something had gone wrong, where a shadow had stepped into her path, unseen. Marianne's apartment on West 86th Street revealed itself as a quiet sanctuary the moment detectives stepped inside, a space shaped by someone who valued order, familiarity, and the subtle comfort of routine. Everything in the small, warmly lit home seemed deliberately placed. Her bed, neatly made with hospital corners, suggested a person who began each day with calm precision. The kitchen counters were spotless. Dishes were washed, dried, and stacked in symmetrical piles inside the cabinet. On her bookshelves, rows of novels and psychology texts stood arranged alphabetically, their spines forming a tidy gradient of muted colors. Nothing appeared hurried or forgotten. Nothing suggested chaos. It was the kind of apartment that told a story, long before the investigation began. Marianne lived gently, predictably, with care for the space she inhabited. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no scuff marks near the hinges, no disrupted furniture that would hint at a struggle. Her handbag sat on the kitchen table, positioned neatly as if she had just set it down after returning home. Inside it, detectives found her wallet, identification, keys, and small personal items. The presence of her keys was especially striking. It suggested she hadn't planned to leave, or at least not to go far.
If she had intended to step out, she would have taken them, but she hadn't. They were still there, untouched. Detectives moved slowly from room to room, taking quiet notes. They paid attention not only to what stood out, but also to what blended in too easily. A single lamp glowed softly in the corner of the living room, the warm bulb casting a faint halo against the wall. Someone had turned it on, either shortly before her disappearance or just after. In the bathroom, a towel hung neatly over the rack, still holding the faint heaviness of moisture. It suggested she had showered recently, perhaps within an hour or two of vanishing. The bedroom held its own subtle clues. A window was cracked open just slightly, allowing a thin draft of cold late November air to seep into the apartment. The curtain shifted gently, pulled inward by each passing gust. From the street below, the murmur of traffic drifted upward. Horns, engines, distant footsteps, all muted by the height of the building. The open window was not wide enough to indicate a point of entry, but it was unusual enough to be noted. As the detectives stood in the center of the small bedroom, absorbing the faint hum of the city outside and the stillness inside, a strange quiet settled over them. There was no overturned chair, no frantic trail of movement, no immediate sign of fear. Instead, there was only absence. An eerie, abrupt void where the rhythm of Marianne's everyday life had simply stopped. The room felt paused, suspended in the exact moment before something unknown entered her world and steered it irreversibly off course. For a long moment, the detectives remained silent, each feeling the weight of that broken routine pressing into the air around them.
Forensic teams moved methodically through the apartment, their ultraviolet lights cutting through the dim interior in soft, sweeping arcs. What looked like an immaculate living space to the naked eye began revealing small betrayals under the glow. Near the front door, technicians discovered faint specks of mud, too fine in texture and too deliberately clustered to have been tracked in during everyday activity. It wasn't the gritty, city sidewalk kind of dirt. It looked almost sifted, as if someone had stepped in it moments before entering and tried, unsuccessfully, not to leave a trace. Carefully, the team knelt, scraping and sealing the soil samples into evidence vials. When they lifted the corner of a decorative throw rug, another detail surfaced, the ghost of a partial footprint. It was narrow, with a slight inward tilt at the arch. Uncommon size and shape that didn't match any of Marianne's shoes. It appeared as if the intruder had tried to hide their presence, but misjudged how far the rug reached. Detectives exchanged quiet glances. This was no random visitor. Someone had been in that apartment with a purpose. While the forensic unit continued its sweep, another team began analyzing Marianne's phone records. On the surface, her call log looked unremarkable. Routine calls to colleagues, a few to her sister, a handful of scheduled reminders. But buried among them were entries that felt wrong. Several brief calls from an unlisted number in the days leading up to her disappearance. Each call lasted only seconds, too short to be a conversation, and always ended before the voicemail function could activate. There were no texts, no follow-ups, no returned calls. Just quick, silent interruptions, spikes in an otherwise calm pattern. Detectives pinned the printouts to a corkboard, studying the timestamps. The calls didn't follow any daily rhythm. They appeared at odd hours, early morning, late afternoon, just past midnight, almost as if someone had been testing her availability, checking whether she was home, alone, or simply receptive. A pattern was forming, subtle but undeniable. Someone had entered her life quietly, watched her movements, reached out in whispers rather than words. As the technicians continued their methodical collection of evidence,
The investigators felt the weight of it settling in. These were the first threads of a deliberate intrusion, one that had begun days before Mary Ann Keller vanished.
The autopsy results revealed what the river's currents had failed to erase. Beneath the water damage and the discoloration of submersion, Marianne's body still carried the signature of her final moments. The medical examiner noted that the cause of death was a single, expertly placed incision to a major artery. Clean, deliberate, and delivered with the kind of anatomical certainty that comes only from training. It was not a frantic slash or a defensive wound. It was a calculated strike, one that had ended her life in seconds. As the examination continued, additional findings began to surface. The other cuts scattered across her torso and limbs were not the chaotic marks of a struggle. Instead, they were post-mortem dissections, executed with a disturbingly methodical precision. The angles were consistent, the spacing almost symmetrical. Whoever had performed them understood human anatomy with a cold, practiced familiarity. Someone comfortable working with a scalpel, someone who knew where to cut and how deep to go without hesitation. Tissue analysis offered another chilling element. There were no signs of bruising or tearing associated with resistance, no defensive wounds on her hands or arms, no fractured nails. It was as if Marianne had never even tried to fight back. The toxicology screen explained. Traces of a sedative, slow-acting, potent, and often used in controlled medical settings were present in her system. She had been rendered unconscious before the fatal incision was made, her body quieted long before the violence began. Piece by piece, the autopsy painted a picture not of a chaotic crime of passion, but of a meticulously orchestrated abduction carried out by someone composed, experienced, and chillingly deliberate. This was the work of a person who planned their steps, eliminated variables, and operated with clinical detachment. When detectives read the final report, the atmosphere in the briefing room shifted. The evidence didn't point to a first-time offender. It suggested someone who had performed this kind of procedure before, and someone who would very likely do it again.
Detectives followed the trail of the unlisted number that had appeared repeatedly in Mary Ann's phone logs, tracing it through telecommunications records until they arrived at its point of purchase, a prepaid mobile bought in a small, cluttered bodega on a quiet stretch of East Harlem. The store owner kept a basic surveillance system, old, slightly flickering cameras mounted high in the corners, and from these, investigators were able to pull several minutes of footage from the day the phone was activated. The video quality was far from ideal. The colors bled together, and the lighting cast long, uneven shadows across the aisles. Yet, in the midst of the static, a figure emerged. The man wore a heavy winter coat, plain, charcoal-colored, and a baseball cap pulled low, the brim creating a hard line of shadow that obscured most of his face. Thick gloves concealed his hands. He moved with a measured, almost unhurried precision, as though he had walked through this scenario countless times before. When he approached the counter, he kept his head angled downward, offering the camera only a partial view. Payment was in cash. Bills folded tightly, passed across the counter without hesitation. The transaction lasted mere seconds. Even the way he exited was controlled, his stride steady, his shoulders square, showing none of the aimless uncertainty typical of impulsive offenders. There was something rehearsed about him, a practiced nonchalance that suggested he had prepared for this moment long before stepping into the store. Detectives scrubbed through the footage frame by frame, enhancing what little the camera had captured. They estimated his height by comparing him to fixed objects in the store, approximately 6 feet tall, give or take an inch. His build appeared lean but not slight, more athletic than average. And at one particular moment, when he glanced briefly toward the candy rack, the dim light caught the edge of his jaw, revealing what looked like a faint mark, a narrow line, possibly a healed scar. It wasn't enough to name him, it wasn't enough to issue a warrant or draw a definitive conclusion, but it was enough to start shaping a profile, enough to turn a faceless collar into a man with weight, posture, and presence, someone who had stepped briefly into the camera's view and left behind just enough for the detectives to know he was real, calculated, and far from careless.
The soil samples collected from the faint traces near Marianne's apartment doorway had been sent to the forensic geology lab, where analysts compared their mineral composition against regional soil databases. The results were unsettlingly specific. The mixture of fine grayish particles threaded with flecks of oxidized metal and industrial resin matched an uncommon soil type found almost exclusively around abandoned industrial properties on the outer fringes of the Bronx. It was a signature blend produced by decades of chemical runoff, decaying concrete, and untreated waste left behind by factories long since shuttered. Armed with this information, detectives mapped each location within the identified radius, creating a narrowed grid of forgotten spaces where such soil was likely to cling to the soles of shoes. Over the next several days, they combed through these derelict zones one by one, old processing plants, collapsed machine shops, storage yards swallowed by weeds and rust. Most were empty, undisturbed, their silence broken only by the hollow echo of boots on cracked flooring. But at a disused medical supply warehouse near River Avenue, something finally broke the pattern. The warehouse, a massive rectangular shell of crumbling brick and broken windows, stood back from the street like a monument to neglect. Its doors were chained loosely, but not locked the way municipal records indicated they should have been. Inside, the air was sharply colder, heavy with the layered sense of rust, mildew, and something sharper, something metallic that refused to blend into the background of decay. Fresh footprints were visible on the dusty concrete floor, their impressions too recent and too sharply defined to belong to city inspectors or trespassing teenagers. Beside them lay discarded strips of cloudy plastic sheeting, curled at the edges as though torn away in haste. Near one wall, streaks of dried adhesive ran downward in uneven lines, suggesting that something, perhaps a tarp or panel, had once been secured there and later ripped free. Detectives moved deeper into the warehouse with the controlled deliberation of people stepping into a space that didn't want to be entered. The beam of their flashlight swept across remnants of what appeared to be makeshift workstations, a long table dragged into position beneath a hanging light fixture, several mismatched metal stools, and an overturned crate littered with small, unfamiliar tools. Dust had gathered on some surfaces, but others showed the smooth, recently disturbed patches where hands or equipment had clearly rested. The realization settled slowly, tightening like a vice around the investigators' thoughts. This wasn't a random squat or forgotten storage hall. Someone had been using the warehouse deliberately, returning often enough to leave a pattern. And whoever it was had chosen a place remote enough to go unnoticed, yet structured enough to accommodate methodical, precise work, the kind that mirrored the marks found on Marianne Keller's body. The faint metallic scent that lingered in the air no longer felt like rust alone. It carried an undertone that raised the hairs on the back of their necks, hinting that the warehouse had been more than a hideaway. It had been a workspace, possibly even a killing ground.
In the farthest corner of the warehouse area, almost swallowed in shadow, where a rusted drain pipe ran from ceiling to floor, crime scene technicians noticed an irregular mound of dust and debris. When they brushed it aside, the edge of a wrapped bundle emerged, carefully tucked against the wall as though hidden by someone who expected to return for it. The cloth was coarse and stained with age, but its corners had been folded with striking precision, forming a tight, deliberate package. When the technicians unwrapped it layer by layer, the contents revealed themselves with chilling clarity. Inside lay an assortment of instruments arranged with the kind of orderly exactness more commonly found in operating rooms than in abandoned warehouses. Surgical blades of varying lengths, clamps with perfectly aligned hinges, and a compact handheld bone saw rested together like pieces of a kit prepared for specialty work. Each tool had been cleaned to a metallic sheen. Under normal light, they looked almost unused, but under forensic scanners, minute traces of biological material clung to the edges. Traces too small for the eye to detect, but unmistakable under laboratory analysis. Those microscopic fragments would later confirm what investigators feared. The DNA matched Marion Keller. It meant she had been here. The warehouse wasn't just a hideout or a meeting point. It had been part of the crime itself, perhaps even the primary site. A few feet away from where the tool bundle had been hidden, investigators discovered something nearly overlooked at first. A narrow gap in the wall's wooden paneling had loosened over time, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside, folded so tightly they seemed intentionally compressed, were several torn pages from medical textbooks. The paper was crisp, edges straight, as if the pages had been taken recently rather than scavenged from an old source. Laid out on the nearby evidence table, the pages presented an unsettling spread. Detailed diagrams of human anatomy, muscular systems, vascular pathways, and the structural contours of the rib cage were marked with thin pencil lines. Notes in a compact, disciplined handwriting ran along the margins, reminders, calculations, annotations identifying ideal entry points for incisions. There were no scribbles betraying confusion, no signs of improvisation or uncertainty. Everything written suggested careful study, deliberate repetition, and an intellect that approached the human body with clinical detachment. The investigators felt a weight settle around them as they examined the materials. Nothing in that hidden cache hinted at desperation or chaotic behavior. Instead, it spoke of someone who planned, observed, and practiced. Someone patient enough to prepare, calculating enough to research, and bold enough to turn an abandoned warehouse into a personal operating chamber. It was no longer a question of whether Marion had been targeted. It was a question of how long the perpetrator had been preparing, and whether this warehouse was only one chapter in a far larger pattern.
As detectives continued to piece together the puzzle, the evidence began to suggest a profile far more precise than any single eyewitness account could provide. Each clue, every detail painstakingly gathered from Marianne's body, her apartment, the warehouse, and the instruments left behind, began to converge on a very specific type of perpetrator. The style of the incisions was clinical, deliberate, and executed with a confidence that only comes from training and repeated practice. The sedation method, confirmed by toxicology, indicated knowledge of pharmacology precise enough to immobilize a human without leaving obvious traces of struggle. Even the meticulous maintenance of the tools, the way the blades were cleaned, arranged, and stored, spoke of a methodical mind that understood hygiene, sharpness, and the preservation of evidence. None of it suggested a casual curiosity or an impulsive act. This was the work of someone who had spent time learning the human body in intimate, detailed ways, yet had applied that knowledge outside any standard clinical or legal setting. It was a criminal signature born of expertise and obsession. With that insight, the investigative team began expanding its search to include individuals with medical backgrounds who had veered into suspicious or unauthorized activity. Former medical students who had been dismissed, physicians who had been suspended, laboratory technicians with documented ethical violations, and anyone known to have fixations on anatomy, mortality, or the manipulation of human tissue, all fell under scrutiny. Hours of record checking, cross-referencing, and database searches began to illuminate patterns previously hidden in plain sight. Among the names that surfaced, one repeatedly appeared with a frequency that made the team uneasy. Dr. Leonard Hale, a former surgical resident, dismissed from a Manhattan hospital residency program 3 years prior due to erratic behavior, repeated breaches of protocol, and unauthorized access to cadaver labs. Reports indicated that Hale had been obsessed with surgical precision, often spending hours alone in anatomy labs under suspicious circumstances. Colleagues described him as brilliant but volatile, someone whose fascination with human anatomy occasionally crossed the boundaries of professionalism. The detectives reviewed his personnel file and disciplinary records with grim focus. The combination of his medical knowledge, his prior access to human cadavers, and his documented behavioral instability made him a match, perhaps chillingly so, for the profile emerging from the layers of evidence left behind in Marianne Keller's murder. Every forensic clue now seemed to whisper in the same voice. The perpetrator was no stranger to the study of the human body, and Dr. Leonard Hale, once a respected surgical resident, had become the person they needed to find.
By the time detectives turned their attention to Dr. Leonard Hale, it became clear that he had disappeared from the structured world of formal employment. No hospital, no clinic, no residency program, he moved in the shadows of society, taking on short-term rentals and part-time jobs that had little to do with medicine. Each location left barely a trace, and his lifestyle was one of constant transience, like a ghost slipping between addresses before anyone could notice. The last confirmed address investigators could locate was already 6 months old, a small basement apartment in a crumbling brick building near the Harlem River. When they arrived, the air around the structure felt damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and neglect. Inside, the apartment had been left without care or concern, as though Hale had vanished in a single deliberate night. Dust coated the floor, collecting in corners and around scattered belongings, and faded medical textbooks lay strewn across the room, their pages splayed open as if abandoned mid-study. One wall, however, drew immediate attention. Hale had pinned a large map of Manhattan with surgical needles, small red circles marking numerous locations across the borough. Some circles were faint, others vivid, but all seemed carefully placed, precise in both selection and spacing. Among them was a cluster that immediately caught the detective's eyes: Marianne Keller's neighborhood, her streets now encoded in the dark logic of his obsession. For a long, silent moment, the detective simply stood, absorbing the room. The map was not merely a collection of points, it was a record of escalation. Each circle, each marked street, suggested a growing confidence, a progression in his movements. It spoke of planning, of observation, of someone growing bolder with each step, more daring, more audacious. The very layout of Manhattan, reduced to pins and lines, became a chilling testament to his methodical mind. In that abandoned apartment, Hale's presence lingered like a shadow, and the detectives understood with a sinking certainty that Marianne's murder was not an isolated act. It was part of a deliberate pattern, and the map in front of them suggested that, left unchecked, his next move would come sooner rather than later.
Armed with a search warrant, detectives spent hours meticulously cross-referencing Dr. Hale's known aliases, dormant bank accounts, vehicle registrations, and every trace of financial activity they could uncover. Patterns began to emerge from the scattered, cryptic fragments of his life. Small clues that suggested he had prepared for disappearance long before he vanished. Among the recurring threads was a storage unit rented under a pseudonym in Mott Haven, a neighborhood of aging warehouses and narrow streets where the city's hum faded into distant rumble.
When detectives arrived, the metal roll-up door was cold to the touch, slick from the lingering humidity that clung to the industrial building. The unit smelled faintly of mildew, mixed with a sharper, almost metallic tang that raised hairs on their arms. Once opened, the scene inside was unlike any storage unit the detectives had ever seen. It resembled a miniature laboratory, organized, precise, and methodically constructed. Tables were lined with preserved specimens, small mammals, fish, and other creatures, each dissected with a level of care that was unnervingly clinical. Their limbs were arranged deliberately, cuts clean and exact, as though each had been a practice in the pursuit of perfect technique. Pinned to corkboards along the walls were detailed notes and diagrams. Procedural refinements were documented in neat, small handwriting, observations about angles, depths, and precision of incisions. The detectives moved slowly through the space, flashlights slicing through the dim light, scanning shelves stacked with medical chemicals, vials of old anesthesia, and boxes of implements that once belonged in a proper surgical environment. The air seemed to pulse with the quiet hum of methodical obsession, every object suggesting purpose, every detail the echo of a mind obsessed with control and mastery. At the far end of the unit, partially concealed beneath a heavy tarp, lay another discovery that made the room feel suddenly smaller, heavier. Beneath it, plastic sheeting, similar to the type found at Marian Keller's murder scene, was stained with faint traces of human blood. The detectives paused, the beam of their flashlights trembling slightly as it fell across the sheet. It was the first direct link to Hale's previous crime, an unmistakable confirmation that the methods used on Marian had not been random nor impulsive. The unit, once merely a rented space, now revealed itself as the true extent of Hale's obsession, a controlled private environment where he honed his techniques, cataloged his knowledge, and practiced with patience and precision. Every specimen, every note, every chemical bottle was a testament to planning and calculation. Standing there, detectives understood that they were looking not just at the tools of a crime, but at the inner workings of a mind capable of repeating it.
As the investigation closed in, a new tip came in. A report of a man matching Dr. Hale's description entering a long-abandoned tenement building near 156th Street. The structure loomed against the gray sky, nearly condemned, its brick facade cracked and pitted from years of neglect. Windows were broken or boarded haphazardly. Graffiti crawled along the walls in fading spray paint, and the stairwells reeked of mold and stale air. The corridors were narrow, uneven, and dimly lit by fractured shafts of daylight filtering through shattered panes. Special units moved in with deliberate caution, boots muffled against peeling tile and warped wood. Each step echoed faintly, a measured rhythm that mirrored the tension coiling in the officers' chests. Their flashlights cut thin beams through the gloom, illuminating debris, chunks of plaster, discarded newspapers, and old wires dangling from ceilings, while shadows shifted with each careful movement. The building felt alive, or perhaps haunted, as if the walls themselves remembered the trespasses of those who had wandered here before. Ascending the creaking stairwell, the officers followed a faint, irregular sound, a metallic scraping, rhythmic and subtle, coming from one of the upper floors. Each step upward deepened the sense of anticipation. The hallways grew narrower, darker, and colder, and the faint metallic scent, oil, rust, something sharper, hung in the air, tickling the back of their throats. At the end of a corridor, a partially collapsed room came into view. The ceiling sagged, chunks of plaster dangling from exposed beams, while cracks ran like veins across the walls. Inside, kneeling at a makeshift table, was Hale. The flicker of their flashlights caught the edge of his coat and the careful alignment of tools laid out before him. Each instrument, blades, clamps, and vials, was arranged with deliberate care. His movements were slow, methodical, almost meditative, as if he were performing a ritual known only to himself. The officers paused just outside the doorway, their presence momentarily unnoticed.
Then in unison, one announced their arrival, voice firm and clear. Hale did not rise, did not bolt, and for a heartbeat the room seemed suspended in stillness. He merely turned his head slightly, eyes flicking toward them with a calm, measured acknowledgement. It was the faintest hint of a smile, or perhaps a recognition of inevitability. He had expected them. The detectives realized in that suspended moment that the confrontation was already written. Hale's preparation, his meticulous habits, his obsession with control, all had led to this quiet culmination. He was exactly where he had intended to be, and yet he was no longer untouchable.
Hale was taken into custody without resistance. There was no struggle, no sudden flare of panic, no frantic attempt to escape. He rose slowly when instructed, his movements deliberate and measured, as if the world outside his controlled environment held little consequence. His demeanor was unnervingly calm, almost statuesque, and his face betrayed nothing. Not fear, not guilt, not remorse. There was no flicker of emotion to indicate recognition of the gravity of the crimes he had committed. Detectives noted the flat, clinical precision in his posture, the controlled way he held his hands, and the quiet steadiness in his gaze, all signs of a mind practiced in suppression and calculation. He did not explain. No protestations, no words of justification. He remained silent, a void of expression, yet somehow radiating an air of quiet certainty, as if he had known this moment would come all along. The arrest felt less like the capture of a criminal than the conclusion of a carefully orchestrated sequence that Hale had anticipated and rehearsed in his mind long before the detectives arrived. As investigators began to sift through his personal effects and the meticulously detailed notes recovered from the storage unit and the abandoned tenement, a disturbing pattern emerged. Marianne Keller had not been a random victim chosen at chance. Among Hale's writings were repeated references to a distant cataloging, a series of observations carefully noted over time. She had volunteered occasionally at a small community clinic, a quiet corner of the Upper West Side, where Hale, during his residency, had shadowed other physicians. Though the two had never spoken, never interacted directly, Hale had watched her from afar, making meticulous notes on her gait, her posture, the alignment of her movements. In his journals and annotated diagrams, he referred to her only in the language of obsession, structural purity. The phrase was clinical, detached, almost mathematical. It suggested a fixation that had nothing to do with human connection or emotion. To Hale, Marianne was not a person. She was a specimen, an object of study, an idealized form to be cataloged, dissected, and understood. Detectives read these notes with growing unease, realizing that the mind behind Marianne's murder had been operating on a plane entirely removed from empathy, entirely removed from humanity itself.
The trial that followed unfolded over months, meticulous and exhaustive, reflecting both the complexity of the case and the meticulous nature of Hale himself. Courtroom walls, lined with dark wood and muted lighting, became the stage for a painstaking presentation of evidence that left no corner of the investigation unexamined. Prosecutors methodically laid out the findings from every location tied to Hale: the abandoned warehouse in Mott Haven, the storage unit filled with instruments and specimens, the dilapidated tenement near 156th Street, and Marianne Keller's own apartment on West 86th Street. Each location was presented with diagrams, photographs, and forensic reconstructions, bringing to life the chilling environments in which Hale had operated. Forensic experts testified in painstaking detail, describing the precision of the incisions on Marianne's body, the calculated sedation methods, and the way each instrument, surgical blades, clamps, bone saws, was connected to Hale through microscopic residue, fingerprints, and his unique patterns of handling. The prosecution demonstrated the continuity between the crime scene, the storage units, and Hale's notes, constructing a portrait of methodical intent that left little room for doubt. Even the minutiae, gypsum dust from floors, traces of plastic identical to the sheeting found at the crime scene, were cataloged and explained, reinforcing the narrative of planning, calculation, and obsessive preparation. The defense sought to cast doubt, portraying Hale as mentally unstable, a man whose obsessions had spiraled out of control. Psychiatric evaluations were presented, but rather than supporting claims of confusion or incompetence, the assessments painted an unnervingly clear picture. Hale understood his actions completely. He had planned, observed, and executed each step of the crime with deliberation and purpose. His intellect and awareness made the act all the more chilling. Throughout the trial, the courtroom became heavy with the weight of evidence and the silence of those witnessing the unfolding truth. When the jury retired to deliberate, it was only a matter of hours before they returned. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. The judge's voice echoed through the chamber as the sentence was pronounced: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the detectives who had followed the trail from the riverbank to the warehouse, from faint footprints to meticulous journals, it was a moment of grim closure. Justice, in its most formal sense, had been served. Yet even as Hale was led away, the chilling awareness remained that his methodical, clinical obsession had left scars far beyond the physical, on the city, on Marianne's family, and on the quiet spaces of human trust that he had violated so utterly.
The alleyways, apartments, and abandoned buildings tied to the case slowly returned to silence. West 86th Street, where Marianne Keller had lived, felt ordinary again. Passers-by hurried along, unaware of the violence that had briefly punctuated the neighborhood. Snow eventually covered the faint stains on the ground, softening the harsh edges of memory. The Hudson River, which had carried her body in its cold embrace, flowed as it always had, mist drifting along its surface, indifferent to the tragedies it bore witness to. The abandoned warehouse in Mott Haven was sealed and catalogued as evidence, yet for those who had entered its shadowed corners, the memory lingered. The faint metallic scent, the meticulous arrangement of tools, the notes of obsession scrawled in precise handwriting. The storage unit, the tenement, the maps and diagrams pinned to walls, all became part of the city's hidden archive of unease, quietly recorded in police files, accessible only to those who sought to remember. For the detectives, the case remained alive long after the trial ended. The meticulousness, the clinical precision, the calculated cruelty, it haunted their steps in quiet moments, in darkened stairwells, and on cold river mornings. They had captured Hale, had seen justice pronounced, yet the knowledge of what he had observed, studied, and acted upon lingered like a shadow over the city. Even as life moved forward, a subtle tension persisted in certain corners of Manhattan. Quiet streets where footsteps echoed differently, hallways in old buildings where the faint scrape of metal against tile could still set nerves on edge. The Winter case, as it was filed in the Manhattan Police Archives, became more than just a record. It was a reminder that, in a city overflowing with lights, motion, and endless human activity, there remain places where darkness waits patiently, where obsession can take root unseen, and where the ordinary is sometimes only a thin veil over the extraordinary capacity for human cruelty. And sometimes, in the cold hush before dawn, It feels as though that darkness is still watching.
Thank you for listening until the very end. If you enjoy wandering into the darker corners of true crime, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive and the silence a little less empty.